A king murdered in the streets of Paris, a child who would become the most powerful monarch in Europe, a palace built to humble an entire nobility, a revolution that sent a king to the guillotine, and a dynasty that, against all odds, survived it all. For more than 2 centuries, the House of Bourbon stood at the center of European history. They ruled France, claimed the throne of Spain, and placed their descendants on the crowns of Naples, Sicily, and Parma. Their wars reshaped borders, their marriages forged alliances, and their ambitions changed the course of a continent. Even today, the King of Spain is a direct descendant of Louis XIV, the Sun King. This is the story of how a small lordship in the heart of France rose from obscurity to become one of the most powerful royal dynasties the world has ever known, and how, more than once, it came dangerously close to destroying itself. But before we begin, if you enjoy in-depth documentaries about history, empires, and royal dynasties, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps make documentaries like this possible. Now, imagine yourself standing on a street in Paris in the spring of 1594. The city has endured years of religious war. Hunger and fear have become part of everyday life. Church bells echo through the streets as thousands gather to witness an extraordinary sight. A battle-hardened Protestant king rides slowly toward the gates of a fiercely Catholic capital that has spent years fighting to keep him out. Some people cheer, others watch in uneasy silence. Many hide their true intentions. Would you have welcomed your new king, or reached for a knife? Let me know in the comments. That king was Henry of Navarre. Within a few years, he would become Henry IV of France, the first Bourbon ever to wear the French crown. His reign would rescue a kingdom exhausted by civil war, transform the fortunes of his family, and lay the foundations for a dynasty that would dominate Europe for centuries. Yet the Bourbons almost never reached the throne at all. Their name came from a small and largely forgotten lordship in central France. For generations, they remained close enough to power to dream of becoming kings, yet distant enough that few believed they ever would. Then the royal line failed, and everything changed. Over the next 4 centuries, the Bourbons would produce a king who changed his religion to win a kingdom. A monarch who transformed Versailles into the greatest palace in Europe, rulers whose wars shook the continent, and a king who climbed the scaffold as revolution swept away the monarchy itself. Yet despite exile, revolution, assassination, and the fall of kingdoms, the dynasty endured. To understand how it all began, we must go back more than 7 centuries to a saint and his 6th son. Long before the Bourbons became the most powerful royal house in Europe, they were only one branch of a much older family. Before Versailles dazzled the world, before the Sun King commanded Europe's attention, before revolutions and restorations shaped their destiny, the Bourbons were simply nobles whose future seemed destined to remain in the shadow of the French crown. Their rise cannot be understood without first understanding the kingdom that gave them life. In the year 987, the French nobles chose Hugh Capet as their king. At the time, this was hardly the beginning of an unstoppable empire. The king ruled directly over only a small domain centered on Paris, while powerful dukes and counts controlled much of the kingdom, often acting with the independence of sovereign rulers. France was a patchwork of feudal territories, united more by loyalty than by strong central authority. Yet generation after generation, the Capetian kings patiently transformed that fragile realm. Through military victories, strategic marriages, inheritance, diplomacy, and careful administration, they expanded royal authority while gradually bringing even the mightiest nobles under the crown's influence. Even more remarkable was their stability. For centuries, the throne passed almost uninterrupted from father to son, an extraordinary achievement in medieval Europe, where dynasties often collapsed through civil war or disputed succession. As the monarchy grew stronger, so too did its prestige. To become King of France was to inherit far more than territory. French kings were crowned in the Cathedral of Reims, where they were anointed with the sacred oil that legend claimed had been sent from heaven for the baptism of the first Christian king of the Franks. The ceremony proclaimed the monarch as God's chosen ruler, and many believed the king possessed the miraculous royal touch capable of healing disease. The French crown was not merely political, it carried profound religious and symbolic authority. No ruler embodied that sacred kingship more completely than Louis IX, remembered to history as Saint Louis. Ascending the throne in 1226 at only 12 years of age under the guidance of his formidable mother, Blanche of Castile, Louis matured into one of medieval Europe's most admired monarchs. He strengthened royal justice, earning a reputation for hearing the grievances of ordinary people with remarkable fairness. His devotion inspired the construction of the magnificent Sainte-Chapelle in Paris to house some of Christianity's most treasured relics, while his determination to defend the faith led him on 2 crusades. During the second, outside the walls of Tunis in 1270, disease claimed his life. Within a generation, the Church canonized him, making him the only king of France officially recognized as a saint. His legacy would shape France for centuries. But the story of the Bourbons does not begin with St. Louis himself. It begins with his 6th son. Born in 1256, Robert of Clermont entered the world with little expectation that history would remember him. Medieval inheritance favored the eldest son, while younger princes usually received lands, titles, and advantageous marriages rather than crowns. Robert's future appeared secure, but unremarkable. History had other plans. In 1272, Robert married Beatrice, heiress to the lordship of Bourbon. At the time, Bourbon was a modest territory in central France, overshadowed by far greater lordships such as Burgundy and Champagne. Few could have imagined that this quiet domain would one day lend its name to Europe's most influential royal dynasty. Like most noble marriages of the Middle Ages, the union was a political alliance rather than a romance. Through Beatrice's inheritance, Robert acquired Bourbon, and their descendants adopted its name, creating a new cadet branch of the Capetian dynasty. The House of Bourbon had been born. Nothing about its beginnings suggested greatness. Robert himself never became one of the leading figures of his age, and after suffering a serious tournament injury, he lived much of his later life away from the center of political power. His family remained respected members of the royal bloodline, but they stood far behind the main line of succession. Even so, the foundations had quietly been laid. The Bourbons possessed 2 priceless advantages. They carried the blood of St. Louis through an unbroken male line, and they now possessed a noble name and territory that distinguished their branch from every other Capetian. Their rise was gradual rather than dramatic. In 1327, Robert's son, Louis, was elevated to the rank of Duke of Bourbon, placing the family among the highest ranks of the French nobility. They expanded their lands through inheritance, forged influential marriages, and faithfully served the French crown. They stood close enough to royal power to matter, but never close enough to expect the throne. One law seemed to guarantee that would never change. Over time, the French monarchy embraced what became known as Salic law, establishing that the crown could pass only through the legitimate male line. Women could neither inherit the throne nor transmit a claim to their descendants. The principle became firmly established during the succession crisis of the early 14th century, when the deaths of 3 Capetian kings, without surviving sons, forced France to decide who possessed the lawful right to rule. The decision rejected the claim of England's Edward III through his mother, a choice that helped ignite the 100 Years' War and permanently shaped the rules of French succession. For the Bourbons, that ruling carried an unexpected consequence. As long as the senior branches of the Capetian family continued producing sons, they would remain loyal princes of the blood, honored, influential, yet forever waiting in the wings. And so they waited. Generations passed. Kings came and went. Wars transformed kingdoms. The Bourbons endured, preserving their bloodline while history seemed to move around them. Then, in the 16th century, France descended into bitter religious conflict. Catholic and Protestant armies ravaged the kingdom, noble families turned upon one another, and the once mighty House of Valois began to run out of heirs. For the first time in nearly 300 years, the impossible no longer seemed impossible. The forgotten descendants of St. Louis were no longer standing at the edge of history. They were about to inherit it. The Bourbons' path to the French throne was neither quick nor inevitable. It was forged in one of the darkest chapters of French history, a generation in which religion, politics, and dynastic ambition tore the kingdom apart. The crisis began in 1559. That year, King Henry II of France died after a lance shattered during a royal joust and pierced his eye. His sudden death left the Valois monarchy in the hands of a succession of young and fragile kings. As royal authority weakened, powerful noble families competed for influence, while Henry's widow, Catherine de' Medici, struggled to preserve both the crown and the kingdom. At the same time, the Protestant Reformation was transforming Europe. The teachings of reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin spread into France, where thousands embraced the Reformed faith and became known as the Huguenots. Religion soon became inseparable from politics. The powerful House of Guise emerged as the champions of militant Catholicism, while many princes of the House of Bourbon became leaders of the Protestant cause. Beginning in 1562, France descended into a series of brutal civil wars. Cities changed hands, harvests failed, churches were desecrated, families were divided. What had begun as a struggle over religion steadily became a struggle over who would control the French kingdom itself. In an effort to end the bloodshed, Catherine de' Medici arranged what appeared to be a remarkable act of reconciliation. Her daughter, Margaret of Valois, would marry Henry of Navarre, the leading Bourbon prince and one of the foremost Protestant nobles in France. The wedding took place in Paris in August 1572. It was supposed to unite a divided kingdom. Instead, it became the prelude to catastrophe. On the night of 24th August 1572, the bells of the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois echoed across Paris. Many believed they were hearing the call to prayer. Instead, they announced the beginning of one of the bloodiest massacres in French history. The violence was triggered after an attempt to assassinate Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most influential Protestant leader at court. When the attempt failed, fear and suspicion spiraled into a coordinated attack on the Protestant leadership gathered in the city for the royal wedding. Before long, the killing spread far beyond its original targets. Homes were stormed, families were dragged into the streets, men, women, and children were slaughtered as Paris descended into terror. In the days that followed, similar massacres erupted in towns and cities across France. Historians continue to debate the final death toll, but it almost certainly reached into the tens of thousands. Among those trapped inside the Louvre that night was the young Henry of Navarre. Unlike many of his companions, he survived. Not because he escaped, but because he publicly renounced the Protestant faith under the threat of death. For the next several years, Henry remained under close watch at the royal court, his freedom severely restricted. Then, in 1576, he escaped, returned openly to Protestantism, and once again assumed leadership of the Huguenot cause. The wars resumed with renewed intensity. As France exhausted itself, the dynastic situation grew ever more dangerous. King Charles IX died without a surviving son. His brother succeeded him as Henry III. When Henry III's younger brother, François, Duke of Anjou, died in 1584 without legitimate heirs, an extraordinary reality emerged. Under the laws governing the French crown, the nearest legitimate male descendant of the Capetian dynasty was no longer a member of the House of Valois. It was Henry of Navarre. For many Catholics, the prospect of a Protestant inheriting the throne of the most Christian kingdom was unacceptable. The Catholic League intensified its resistance, and France entered the final and most violent phase of the Wars of Religion. History remembers it as the War of the Three Henrys: Henry III, the reigning king; Henry of Guise, leader of the Catholic League; and Henry of Navarre, the Bourbon heir whose lawful claim threatened to overturn the kingdom's political order. In 1588, fearing that the House of Guise had become too powerful, Henry III ordered the assassination of Henry of Guise at the Château of Blois. The decision failed to restore his authority. Instead, it plunged the kingdom even deeper into crisis. With few allies remaining, the king entered into an unlikely alliance with the very man he had once opposed, Henry of Navarre. Together they prepared to retake Paris from the Catholic League. They never reached the city. On August 1, 1589, a Dominican friar named Jacques Clément gained access to the royal camp under the pretense of delivering important information. Once admitted to the king's presence, he drew a knife and mortally wounded Henry III. The last Valois king died the following day. With him ended more than 2.5 centuries of Valois rule. By every accepted law of succession, Henry of Navarre now became King Henry IV of France. Yet claiming the crown and ruling the kingdom were two very different things. Much of Catholic France refused to recognize him. Paris remained in hostile hands. Many regarded him as a heretic rather than a lawful king. Years of war followed before Henry confronted the difficult reality facing him. Victory on the battlefield alone could not reunite France. Increasing numbers of moderates had come to believe that preserving the kingdom mattered more than prolonging religious conflict. In 1593, Henry announced his conversion to Catholicism. Whether motivated by conviction, political necessity, or both, the decision transformed the course of French history. According to a famous tradition, he remarked that Paris is well worth a mass, though historians continue to debate whether he actually spoke those words. The following year, Henry entered Paris as king. The Bourbon dynasty had finally reached the French throne after nearly 3 centuries of waiting. But Henry understood that winning the crown was only the beginning. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, granting substantial protections to France's Protestant minority while preserving Catholicism as the kingdom's official faith. The settlement pleased neither side completely, yet it brought a measure of peace to a kingdom exhausted by decades of bloodshed. Henry had secured France. His next task would be even greater. He had to rebuild it. Henry IV had won the throne. Now he faced a far greater challenge: rebuilding a kingdom that decades of civil war had nearly destroyed. By the close of the 16th century, France was exhausted. Entire provinces had been ravaged by repeated campaigns. Agricultural production had collapsed in many regions, commerce had been severely disrupted, and the royal treasury was burdened by enormous debts accumulated through years of conflict. Restoring stability would require more than military victories. It demanded careful government, financial discipline, and a long-term vision for the kingdom's future. To accomplish this, Henry relied upon one of the most capable administrators of his age, Maximilien de Bethune, better known as the Duke of Sully. The two men had fought together during the Wars of Religion, and Henry trusted him completely. Although Sully remained a Protestant while serving a Catholic king, their partnership reflected the practical spirit that increasingly defined the Bourbon monarchy. As superintendent of finances, Sully inherited a government on the verge of bankruptcy. He reduced unnecessary spending, strengthened oversight of royal revenues, pursued corrupt officials who had enriched themselves at the crown's expense, and reorganized financial administration to ensure taxes reached the treasury instead of disappearing into private pockets. Gradually, confidence in the monarchy's finances returned, allowing the government to reduce debt while rebuilding its reserves. Yet Henry and Sully understood that prosperity could not be measured by the treasury alone. The true strength of France lay in its countryside. Fields abandoned during the wars were brought back into cultivation. Marshes were drained to create new farmland. Roads and bridges damaged by years of conflict were repaired, making it easier for merchants to move goods between towns and provinces. New canals improved transportation, while the planting of mulberry trees encouraged a growing silk industry that reduced dependence on foreign imports. Agriculture remained at the heart of their vision. Sully famously argued that farming and livestock formed the twin foundations of the kingdom's wealth. As harvests improved and trade revived, France slowly emerged from the devastation of civil war. The recovery extended beyond Europe. French merchants and explorers expanded their presence across the Atlantic, seeking both commercial opportunities and permanent settlements. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. What began as a modest settlement became the foundation of New France, the first lasting foothold of a colonial empire that would eventually stretch across vast regions of North America. Henry hoped that ordinary people, not merely nobles and merchants, would share in the kingdom's recovery. A famous tradition claims he wished that every French family could place a chicken in the pot each Sunday. Whether he ever spoke those exact words remains uncertain, but the saying endured because it reflected the image many associated with his reign. A king who believed the success of a nation should be measured by the well-being of its people. Henry himself was a man of striking contrasts. A gifted soldier and determined statesman, he was also renowned for his numerous love affairs, earning the nickname the Green Gallant. His first marriage to Margaret of Valois produced no children and was eventually annulled. In 1600, he married Marie de Medici, whose substantial dowry strengthened the royal finances and whose children secured the future of the Bourbon dynasty. Among them was the future Louis XIII, ensuring that the male line established centuries earlier by Robert of Clermont would continue. Although peace had returned to France, Henry's attention increasingly turned abroad. The powerful Habsburg dynasties of Spain and Austria still surrounded the kingdom, limiting French influence across Europe. By 1610, Henry was preparing for a major campaign that he hoped would challenge Habsburg dominance and strengthen France's position among the great powers. He would never lead that army. Throughout his reign, Henry had survived numerous assassination attempts. To religious extremists, his conversion to Catholicism had not erased his Protestant past, while his policy of toleration convinced others that he had betrayed the faith. Fanatics continued to view the king as an enemy chosen by God for destruction. One of them was François Ravaillac. Convinced that Henry intended to wage war against Catholic Europe, Ravaillac believed it was his sacred duty to stop him. On the 14th of May, 1610, as the king's carriage slowed in the crowded streets of Paris, the assassin forced his way through the gathering and climbed onto the vehicle. Before the royal guards could react, he drove a knife into Henry's chest. Then he struck again. The king died soon afterward. Ravaillac was captured immediately, interrogated, convicted of regicide, and executed with extraordinary severity, a punishment intended to demonstrate that the murder of a king was an offense against both the crown and the kingdom itself. But no sentence could reverse what had been done. France had lost the monarch who ended its civil wars, restored its finances, and laid the foundations of Bourbon greatness. His death left unfinished ambitions abroad. It also left behind something far more fragile: a child. Henry's son, Louis XIII, inherited the throne while still a boy. Once again, France found itself ruled by a minor, and, as had happened before, powerful figures at court prepared to compete for influence over the young king. The Bourbon dynasty had survived its uncertain beginning. Its greatest test, however, was only just beginning. Louis XIII was only 8 years old when he inherited the throne. Too young to govern, he ruled in name, while his mother, Marie de Medici, assumed the regency. It was the second time in less than a century that France had found itself guided by a queen mother during the minority of a king. Yet Marie's government struggled from the very beginning. Determined to secure her son's position, she abandoned many of Henry IV's foreign policies and pursued closer ties with Habsburg Spain. To strengthen the new relationship, she arranged the marriage of Louis XIII to Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess despite her title, which reflected the Habsburg House of Austria rather than the modern nation. At court, however, it was not the royal marriage that attracted the most attention. It was the astonishing rise of an Italian nobleman named Concino Concini and his wife, Leonora Galigai. Favored by the queen, the couple accumulated wealth, offices, and influence at remarkable speed. To many French nobles, they became symbols of corruption and foreign interference. Resentment spread rapidly through the kingdom, while great aristocratic families began challenging the authority of the regency. Seeking to restore stability, the crown summoned the Estates General in 1614. The assembly brought together representatives of the clergy, the nobility, and the common people to advise the king on matters affecting the realm. Although it resolved little, its meeting would later acquire enormous historical significance. It would not be called again for another 175 years. When it finally reconvened in 1789, France would be on the eve of revolution. Meanwhile, the young king grew increasingly frustrated. Although Louis had reached his teenage years, real authority remained in the hands of his mother and her favorites. Determined to free himself from their control, he acted with startling decisiveness. In 1617, royal guards confronted Concino Concini as he entered the Louvre. He was shot dead on the king's orders. Within days, Louis assumed personal control of the government, while Marie de Medici was removed from power and sent into exile. The dramatic coup marked the true beginning of Louis XIII's reign. Unlike his father, Louis inspired neither affection nor admiration through force of personality. He was quiet, reserved, frequently ill. He preferred discipline to spectacle and rarely sought the public attention that had come so naturally to Henry IV. Yet beneath that reserved exterior lay an important strength. He recognized talent, and no appointment would shape the future of France more than the rise of Armand Jean du Plessis. History remembers him simply as Cardinal Richelieu. By 1624, Richelieu had become the king's chief minister. Over the next 18 years, he transformed both the French monarchy and the balance of power in Europe. His objective was remarkably straightforward: one king, one government, one France. To achieve it, every rival center of power had to be brought under royal authority. The first challenge came from the Huguenots. Although the Edict of Nantes had granted French Protestants freedom of worship, it had also allowed them to maintain fortified towns for their own protection. Richelieu regarded these strongholds as dangerous exceptions to royal authority. The greatest of them was La Rochelle. Situated on France's Atlantic coast, the wealthy port had become the political and military heart of French Protestantism. Supported by England and protected by formidable defenses, it appeared almost impossible to conquer. Richelieu accepted the challenge. Royal forces surrounded the city by land, while engineers constructed an enormous seawall across the harbor, cutting off supplies arriving by sea. The siege lasted more than a year. Hunger gradually achieved what artillery could not. In 1628, La Rochelle surrendered. The victory marked a turning point. Richelieu did not seek to destroy Protestantism itself. Instead, he stripped the Huguenots of their political independence and military strongholds, while largely preserving the religious freedoms granted under the Edict of Nantes. Faith could remain. Independent power could not. The same principle guided his treatment of the nobility. For generations, powerful dukes and princes had behaved almost as rulers within their own territories, maintaining private fortresses and raising armies capable of challenging the crown. Richelieu dismantled that system piece by piece. Unauthorized castles were demolished, conspiracies were crushed. Even the highest nobles discovered that birth alone could no longer protect them from royal justice. At the same time, the crown increasingly relied on royal officials, known as intendants, to oversee the provinces. Appointed directly by the king, they weakened the influence of local nobles and ensured that royal authority reached every corner of the kingdom more effectively than ever before. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Many at court longed to see Richelieu fall. The greatest challenge came in 1630 during the episode remembered as the Day of the Dupe. Marie de Medici believed she had finally persuaded her son to dismiss the cardinal. Courtiers rushed to congratulate one another, convinced Richelieu's career had ended. They celebrated too soon. Louis XIII reaffirmed his complete confidence in his minister. It was not Richelieu who fell from power. It was the Queen Mother. Forced into exile, she would never again play a significant role in French politics. Richelieu's influence now stood stronger than ever. His legacy extended beyond politics. In 1635, he established the Académie Française, an institution charged with preserving and guiding the French language. Nearly 4 centuries later, it continues to serve that role. Beyond France's borders, Richelieu pursued an equally ambitious strategy. The Habsburg dynasties of Spain and Austria dominated much of Europe, surrounding France on several fronts. Breaking that encirclement became one of his greatest priorities. When the 30 Years' War engulfed Central Europe, Richelieu made a decision that shocked contemporaries. Although he was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, he supported Protestant powers against the Catholic Habsburgs. Religion, he believed, could not be allowed to outweigh the interests of the French state. This principle, later known as raison d'etat, would become one of the defining ideas of modern European politics. Success brought enemies. Plots against Richelieu became increasingly common, but his extensive network of informants repeatedly uncovered conspiracies before they could succeed. The most dramatic involved Henri Coiffier de Rouzet, Marquis of Cinq-Mars, a favorite of Louis XIII himself. Believing he could remove the cardinal, Cinq-Mars secretly negotiated with Spain, France's wartime enemy. The conspiracy was discovered. Presented with undeniable evidence, the king chose the state over personal friendship. Cinq-Mars was executed. Even in failing health, Richelieu remained indispensable. He died in December 1642. Only a few months later, Louis XIII followed him to the grave. Before his death, however, the king witnessed what many believed would never happen. After more than 2 decades of marriage, Anne of Austria finally gave birth to a son in 1638. The child was named Louis Dieudonné, God-given, because his arrival was widely regarded as miraculous. A second son followed 2 years later, securing the Bourbon succession at last. Once again, France would be governed by a child. But this child inherited a kingdom profoundly different from the one his grandfather had received. Royal authority was stronger. The nobility had been subdued. The machinery of government had been centralized. The foundations of absolute monarchy had been laid. The young king who now inherited that system would carry it to heights no European monarch had ever achieved. His name was Louis XIV. Louis XIV was only 4 years old when his father died in 1643. The Bourbon dynasty had once again passed to a child. Although France was stronger than it had been a generation earlier, the kingdom still faced enormous challenges. War against the Habsburgs continued, the treasury remained under constant strain, and the work of strengthening royal authority was far from complete. Until the young king came of age, power rested in the hands of his mother, Anne of Austria. Serving beside her was the man chosen to continue Cardinal Richelieu's work, an Italian-born statesman named Cardinal Jules Mazarin. Mazarin possessed extraordinary diplomatic skill and a sharp political mind. He was determined to preserve Richelieu's vision of a powerful, centralized monarchy while continuing France's struggle against the Habsburgs abroad. But ability did not make him popular. To many French nobles, Mazarin was an outsider. They resented the influence of a foreign cardinal at the heart of government, especially as the wars demanded ever greater taxes from an already exhausted kingdom. Meanwhile, Mazarin accumulated immense wealth, eventually becoming one of the richest men in France. His decision to bring several of his young Italian nieces to court and arrange prestigious marriages for them only deepened accusations that he was enriching both himself and his family through royal favor. Discontent simmered for years. Then it erupted. Beginning in 1648, France was shaken by a series of uprisings remembered collectively as the Fronde. The name came from a simple slingshot used by children in the streets of Paris. The rebellion itself was anything but childish. At first, opposition came from the Parlement of Paris and other judicial bodies, which resisted new taxes and challenged the growing power of the crown. Historians call this first phase the Fronde of the Parlement. Before long, the unrest spread. Powerful princes and nobles saw an opportunity to recover the independence that Richelieu had spent decades stripping away. Their revolt became known as the Fronde of the Princes. France once again drifted toward civil conflict. The crisis became even more dramatic because two of the greatest military commanders of the age found themselves on opposite sides. Louis II, Prince of Condé, the brilliant general whose victories had made him a hero of France, eventually turned against the crown and even accepted support from Spain, France's longtime enemy. Standing against him was another military genius, Marshal Turenne, who remained loyal to the young king and fought to preserve royal authority. For years, alliances shifted. Armies marched across the kingdom. Foreign powers intervened. On more than one occasion, the royal family was forced to abandon Paris and flee the capital. For the young Louis XIV, these were not distant political events. They were deeply personal memories. He watched rebellious nobles challenge the authority of the crown. He saw his own family driven from their capital. According to a famous tradition, a crowd of rebels once entered the royal residence to make certain the boy king had not escaped. Louis is said to have remained perfectly still, pretending to sleep as they passed beside his bed. Whether every detail of the story is true remains uncertain. Its lesson, however, certainly was. Louis never forgot the humiliation of those years. He became convinced that no king should ever again be at the mercy of rebellious nobles, defiant cities, or competing centers of power. The Fronde ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own divisions. The nobles distrusted the judges. The judges distrusted the nobles. Ordinary French men and women, exhausted by years of disorder, increasingly longed for stability more than political victory. By the early 1650s, The monarchy had regained control, and Mazarin returned to power stronger than before. He remained at the center of government for the rest of his life. Under his leadership, France finally brought its long struggle with Spain to a close. The Treaty of the Pyrenees, signed in 1659, ended decades of conflict, confirmed France's growing dominance in Europe, and established much of the modern frontier between France and Spain. The peace also produced a marriage that would shape European history. Louis XIV married Maria Theresa of Spain, daughter of the Spanish king. On paper, the agreement appeared straightforward. Maria Theresa renounced her claim to the Spanish throne in exchange for an enormous dowry. But there was a problem. The promised payment was never made in full. At the time, few appreciated the significance of that failure. In the decades ahead, France would argue that the unpaid dowry invalidated the renunciation itself, an argument that would become one of the principal justifications for Bourbon claims to the Spanish inheritance. In 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died. For nearly 40 years, France had been governed by towering ministers, first Richelieu, then Mazarin. Almost everyone expected the young king to appoint another chief minister. Instead, Louis astonished the court. He announced that there would be no successor. From that moment forward, every important decision of state would pass through him alone. The era of the ruling cardinals had come to an end. The era of personal royal government had begun. And in the decades that followed, Louis XIV would come to embody absolute monarchy more completely than any European ruler before or since. When Louis XIV assumed personal control of the government in 1661, he did far more than inherit a throne. He set out to reshape the very nature of monarchy. Previous Bourbon kings had relied on powerful chief ministers to govern in their name. Louis intended to govern in his own. Every important decision would ultimately pass through him. His ministers would advise. They would administer. But they would never rule. Over the decades that followed, Louis worked with remarkable discipline. He attended lengthy meetings of his royal councils, read reports from across the kingdom, and involved himself in matters ranging from foreign policy to finance. Governing was not a ceremonial duty, but a daily occupation. By making himself the indispensable center of government, he gradually created a system in which authority flowed outward from the king alone. To make such a system function required capable servants, and none proved more valuable than Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert's rise was made possible by the spectacular downfall of another royal official. Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances, had become one of the wealthiest and most influential men in France. His magnificent estate at Vaux-le-Vicomte was unlike anything Europe had seen, a masterpiece of architecture, gardens, and artistic display. In 1661, Fouquet welcomed the young king with a lavish celebration intended to demonstrate his loyalty. Instead, it demonstrated something else. The king's own servant appeared to possess greater wealth and splendor than the crown itself. Louis had long suspected Fouquet of enriching himself through corruption, but the dazzling display convinced him that no subject, however talented, could ever be allowed to overshadow the monarchy. Only weeks later, Fouquet was arrested by the king's famous captain of the guards, Charles de Batz, better known to history as D'Artagnan. After a lengthy trial, Fouquet spent the remainder of his life imprisoned. The message echoed throughout France. No servant of the king would ever rival the king. The magnificent artists, architects, and landscape designers who had transformed Vaux-le-Vicomte were soon employed on a far greater royal project. With Fouquet removed, Colbert became the architect of France's economic revival. Born into a merchant family rather than the ancient nobility, Colbert rose through ability rather than birth. Tireless, methodical, and fiercely loyal, he believed that a powerful monarchy required a powerful economy. Wealth meant soldiers, fleets, fortifications, diplomacy, and the resources to sustain France's growing influence across Europe. He therefore attacked the kingdom's financial problems with relentless determination. Corrupt officials were investigated. Royal accounts were carefully reorganized. Wasteful spending was reduced wherever possible. Tax collection became more efficient, allowing far more revenue to reach the royal treasury instead of disappearing into private pockets. His broader economic policy, later known as mercantilism, sought to make France as prosperous and self-sufficient as possible. Domestic industries received royal encouragement. Luxury manufactures such as silk, tapestries, mirrors, and fine textiles expanded dramatically, reducing France's dependence on foreign imports while increasing valuable exports. Colbert also strengthened the merchant marine and expanded the Royal Navy, understanding that commercial prosperity and naval power were inseparable. Roads and canals improved transportation throughout the kingdom, allowing goods to move more efficiently between provinces. Agriculture remained equally important. Louis and Colbert recognized that no kingdom could prosper if its countryside remained impoverished. Marshlands were drained, forests better managed, and cultivation expanded across abandoned farmland. Mulberry trees were planted to encourage silk production, while improvements to roads and bridges connected rural producers with growing urban markets. Trade flourished once again. As prosperity gradually returned, France emerged from the devastation of the wars of religion stronger than it had been for generations. The kingdom's ambitions also stretched beyond Europe. French merchants, explorers, and settlers increased their activities across the Atlantic. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain had founded Quebec on the St. Lawrence River, establishing the first permanent foundations of New France. During Louis's reign, these colonial possessions continued to expand, laying the groundwork for an empire that would one day extend from the Gulf of St. Lawrence deep into the interior of North America. Henry IV had dreamed of restoring France. Louis XIV intended to make it one of the world's great powers. The king also completed another transformation begun by his grandfather and strengthened by Cardinal Richelieu. The old independence of the French nobility steadily disappeared. Rather than confronting the great aristocratic families through constant violence, Louis employed a far subtler strategy. He drew them toward his court, where titles, pensions, military commands, and royal favor became the currency of ambition. Noblemen increasingly competed not for independent power in their own provinces, but for the privilege of standing closest to the king. Attendance at court became a necessity. Absence became a political risk. The aristocracy that had once challenged the monarchy gradually became dependent upon it. Meanwhile, the provinces were governed by royal officials known as intendants. These administrators supervised taxation, justice, policing, and the enforcement of royal decrees, answering directly to the crown rather than local nobles. Across France, regional authority slowly yielded to centralized government. There would no longer be many competing centers of power. There would be one, the king. Louis demanded the same discipline from his ministers that he expected from himself. Alongside Colbert stood another remarkable administrator, François-Michel Le Tellier, Marquis de Louvois. If Colbert strengthened France's finances, Louvois transformed its military. The French army became larger, more disciplined, and more professional than ever before. Regular training replaced many older practices. Supply systems improved. Uniforms became increasingly standardized. Promotion depended more upon merit and experience than simple noble birth, while military hospitals and institutions for wounded veterans reflected an unprecedented concern for the welfare of soldiers. By the latter decades of Louis's reign, France possessed the most formidable standing army in Europe. Economic strength and military power reinforced one another. Together they became the twin foundations of Bourbon supremacy. Yet Louis understood that authority rested not only upon armies and wealth, it also depended upon image. From an early age, the king consciously crafted a public identity unlike any European ruler before him. He adopted the sun as his personal emblem, presenting himself as the radiant center around which the kingdom revolved. Just as the planets depended upon the sun, every institution of France would revolve around the monarch. The symbolism became inseparable from his reign. History remembers him simply as the Sun King. His patronage transformed France into Europe's cultural capital. Writers such as Molière entertained audiences with brilliant comedies. The composer Jean-Baptiste Lully shaped the sound of the royal court. Painters, sculptors, architects, and scholars flourished under generous royal sponsorship. French fashions spread from court to court. French architecture became the standard others sought to imitate. Even the French language rose to become the preferred language of diplomacy among Europe's ruling elites. Culture itself became another instrument of royal power. The glory of France reflected the glory of its king. Yet beneath the brilliance lay growing strain. The magnificent court, expanding bureaucracy, ambitious building projects, and increasingly powerful military demanded enormous financial resources. Much of that burden fell upon ordinary peasants, while many nobles and clergy continued to enjoy extensive tax exemptions. The monarchy glittered with extraordinary splendor. The people paid much of the cost. Even Colbert, whose reforms had strengthened the kingdom so dramatically, died exhausted and deeply unpopular. So bitter was public resentment toward taxation that soldiers reportedly guarded his funeral procession against angry crowds. It was an early warning. The system Louis created was astonishingly successful, but it demanded constant wealth, constant discipline, and constant obedience. For the moment, those demands could still be met. France stood at the height of its influence. Its government was stronger than ever before. Its army dominated Europe. Its culture became the envy of rival courts. Now Louis required a setting worthy of the monarchy he had built. Not merely a royal residence, but a palace that would embody absolute power itself. That palace would be Versailles. The triumph of Louis XIV was not measured only in victories, laws, or wealth. It could be seen in stone. Far from the crowded streets of Paris stood a royal residence unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. What had begun decades earlier as a modest hunting lodge under Louis XIII would become the greatest symbol of Bourbon power. A palace so magnificent that foreign ambassadors struggled to describe it, rival monarchs hurried to imitate it, and generations of visitors would regard it as the pinnacle of absolute monarchy. Its name was Versailles. The decision to transform Versailles was not merely an architectural one, it was deeply political. As a child, Louis XIV had watched rebellious nobles and angry crowds force the royal family to flee Paris during the Fronde. The experience left a permanent mark on him. Never again would he allow the monarchy to remain vulnerable to the turbulence of the capital or the ambitions of powerful aristocrats. Instead, he created a new center of power. Beginning in the 1660s, the palace expanded year after year. New wings stretched outward from the original hunting lodge. Vast courtyards welcomed diplomats and nobles from across Europe. Miles of formal gardens, carefully designed canals, elegant fountains, and ornamental groves surrounded the growing palace, each arranged with remarkable precision. Nothing was accidental. Every avenue, every statue, and every reflecting pool formed part of a carefully planned vision in which order triumphed over chaos. In 1682, Louis made the decisive move. The royal court and the machinery of government officially relocated from Paris to Versailles. From that moment onward, Anyone hoping to influence French politics would have to come to the king. Versailles quickly became far more than a royal residence. It became the political heart of France. The palace allowed Louis to accomplish something earlier kings had struggled to achieve. He brought the kingdom's most powerful nobles under his constant observation. Rather than governing independently from their provincial estates, many aristocrats now spent much of the year living at court. Their wealth, influence, military appointments, and political ambitions increasingly depended upon royal favor. Competition did not disappear. It simply changed. Instead of raising private armies or plotting rebellion, ambitious nobles competed for invitations, appointments, honors, and even the smallest signs of the king's approval. A smile from Louis could elevate a career. His silence could end one. Life at Versailles revolved around ceremony. Every part of the king's day followed a carefully choreographed routine witnessed by selected members of the court. The most famous rituals were the lever and the coucher, the ceremonies marking the king's rising each morning and his retirement each evening. To modern eyes, the honors seemed almost absurd. Courtiers competed fiercely for the privilege of handing the king his gloves, presenting his shirt, or holding a candlestick as he prepared for bed. Yet these seemingly trivial duties carried enormous political significance. They demonstrated closeness to the monarch, and closeness to the monarch meant influence. Louis understood that prestige could be as powerful as force. By making access to himself the greatest prize in the kingdom, he transformed ambitious nobles into rivals for royal attention rather than rivals for royal authority. The palace itself reinforced that message. Among its most celebrated spaces stood the Hall of Mirrors. Stretching for more than 70 meters, the magnificent gallery reflected sunlight pouring through enormous windows onto hundreds of glittering mirrors opposite. During evening celebrations, thousands of candles multiplied endlessly across the polished glass, creating a spectacle that left foreign visitors speechless. Mirrors were among the most expensive luxury goods of the 17th century. Displaying hundreds of them in a single room was not merely decoration. It was a declaration that France possessed both the wealth and craftsmanship to surpass its rivals. Beyond the palace, the celebrated gardens of André Le Nôtre extended toward the horizon. Nature itself appeared disciplined. Trees stood in perfect alignment. Hedges formed exact geometric patterns. Fountains erupted according to carefully engineered designs. Everything conveyed the same message. Just as the gardens had been brought under perfect control, so too had the kingdom. Versailles was a palace where even meals became public performances. At the Grand Couvert, the king dined before an audience, while nobles and distinguished visitors observed every detail of the ceremony. Throughout the year, hunts, concerts, theatrical performances, fireworks, masquerades, and magnificent festivals filled the royal calendar. Entertainment itself became an instrument of government. A busy nobility was a manageable nobility. As years passed, however, the atmosphere gradually changed. The youthful court that had once delighted in endless celebrations became increasingly restrained. Following the death of Queen Marie-Thérèse, Louis formed a close relationship with Madame de Maintenon, whom he is widely believed to have secretly married. Deeply religious and personally reserved, she encouraged a more serious tone at court. The extravagant pleasures of Louis's younger years slowly gave way to greater formality and devotion, reflecting both the king's advancing age and the growing burdens of his reign. Versailles also revealed the structure of French society itself. At its summit stood the court nobility, clothed in embroidered silks, lace, velvet, and jewels, living amidst elaborate etiquette where appearance often mattered as much as achievement. Beneath them flourished an increasingly prosperous bourgeoisie, merchants, lawyers, financiers, and royal officials whose wealth expanded alongside the kingdom's economy. Many purchased offices that elevated their social standing and tied their fortunes ever more closely to the monarchy. Below both stood the overwhelming majority of the population. The peasants. They cultivated the fields, harvested the crops, paid many of the kingdom's taxes, and supplied the labor upon which the wealth of France ultimately depended. While Versailles dazzled Europe, countless ordinary families lived modest lives shaped by harvests, church festivals, and the uncertainties of the rural economy. The brilliance of the palace rested upon their work. Constructing Versailles demanded extraordinary resources. For decades, thousands of architects, craftsmen, sculptors, painters, engineers, gardeners, soldiers, and laborers transformed the countryside into a monumental seat of government. Massive hydraulic systems struggled to supply water for the famous fountains, while the expanding palace consumed enormous quantities of stone, timber, marble, and precious metals. The undertaking became one of the largest construction projects Europe had ever witnessed. Yet the investment achieved precisely what Louis intended. Versailles became the model that every ambitious ruler wished to emulate. Across Europe, monarchs commissioned grand palaces inspired by its architecture, redesigned gardens in the French style, adopted French fashions, and embraced French as the language of diplomacy and aristocratic society. For decades, France did not merely dominate European politics. It defined European taste. Versailles proclaimed that supremacy more convincingly than any battlefield ever could. But magnificence carried its own price. Every new gallery, every fountain, every celebration, every regiment marching beneath the Bourbon banners demanded money. As long as France remained prosperous, the system appeared unshakable. Yet even the richest kingdom in Europe possessed limits. And Louis XIV, convinced that France's greatness must also be proven on the battlefield, would soon embark upon a series of wars that would test those limits as never before. Louis XIV spent much of his reign at war. From the moment he assumed control of the government, he believed that France's security, prestige, and greatness depended on expanding its frontiers and establishing French supremacy in Europe. To achieve that ambition, he relied on the largest, best-equipped, and most professionally organized army the continent had seen in centuries. Years of careful reform, under ministers like Louvois, transformed what had once been a patchwork of feudal forces into a permanent standing army. Soldiers received standardized training, uniforms became more consistent, supply systems improved, and promotion increasingly rewarded ability rather than noble birth. France was no longer simply raising armies for individual wars. It had become a military state. No one contributed more to that transformation than the brilliant military engineer Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban. Vauban revolutionized the science of war. Along France's vulnerable frontiers, he designed an extraordinary network of star-shaped fortresses whose angled walls and overlapping fields of fire made them immensely difficult to capture. Together they formed what contemporaries proudly called the Iron Frontier, a defensive shield protecting the kingdom's borders. Yet Vauban was just as formidable on the attack. He perfected the art of siege warfare with such mathematical precision that campaigns increasingly resembled engineering projects rather than chaotic medieval assaults. Carefully planned trenches, artillery positions, and methodical advances allowed French armies to reduce even the strongest fortresses with remarkable efficiency. His influence was so profound that military engineers continued studying his methods for centuries after his death. Backed by this formidable military machine, Louis embarked upon a series of ambitious wars. During the early decades of his reign, those wars appeared to justify every expectation. France steadily expanded its borders. The War of Devolution strengthened French influence in the Spanish Netherlands. The Franco-Dutch War humbled one of Europe's greatest commercial powers. Later, conflicts secured important frontier fortresses, including the strategic city of Strasbourg and much of Alsace, bringing France closer to the natural frontier of the Rhine that many French statesmen had long desired. By the late 17th century, France stood unquestionably as Europe's leading military power. But success carried its own dangers. Each French victory alarmed neighboring kingdoms. One after another, Louis's rivals abandoned their differences and united against him. The Dutch Republic, England, the Austrian Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Empire, Spanish territories, Italian states. Again and again, Europe formed grand alliances for one purpose above all else: to contain the growing power of Bourbon France. As the years passed, Louis's wars became longer, more expensive, and far less decisive. Even victory came at an increasingly unbearable price. While France struggled abroad, Louis made one of the most consequential decisions of his entire reign at home. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. Nearly 90 years earlier, his grandfather Henry IV had ended decades of religious bloodshed by granting France's Protestants limited rights and legal protection. Louis chose a different path. Convinced that religious unity would strengthen the kingdom, he outlawed Protestant worship, ordered Huguenot churches and schools destroyed, and demanded conversion to Catholicism. To many Catholics, the decision seemed both righteous and overdue. History would judge it very differently. Although emigration was officially forbidden, hundreds of thousands of Huguenots fled France. Among them were merchants, master craftsmen, manufacturers, soldiers, bankers, and skilled professionals whose knowledge had helped fuel the kingdom's prosperity. They carried those talents to England, the Dutch Republic, Brandenburg, Prussia, Switzerland, and the American colonies, strengthening France's rivals while weakening France itself. The dynasty that had once become famous for ending religious civil war had now reversed one of its greatest achievements. The methods used to enforce conversion only deepened the tragedy. Under a policy known as the Dragonnades, royal soldiers were quartered inside Protestant homes and given broad freedom to harass, intimidate, and abuse their unwilling hosts until they agreed to embrace Catholicism. Many conversions followed. Few were sincere. In the remote mountains of southern France, Protestant resistance eventually erupted into open rebellion. The insurgents, remembered as the Camisards, fought a determined guerrilla war against royal troops during the opening years of the 18th century. Suppressing the revolt required years of costly military operations. The conflict exposed the limits of absolute monarchy. A king could outlaw a religion, destroy it, churches punish its followers. But belief itself proved far harder to conquer. Even as religious tensions simmered, an even greater crisis emerged beyond France's borders. The aging King Charles II of Spain had no children. For decades, Europe's rulers had dreaded the question everyone knew was coming. Who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire? It was one of the largest empires on earth, stretching across Spain, much of Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and enormous territories throughout the Americas and Asia. Its fate would reshape the balance of power across the world. Through his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, Louis XIV possessed a powerful dynastic claim. When Charles II died in 1700, his will named Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, as heir to the entire Spanish inheritance. The decision transformed European politics overnight. We will soon follow Philip to Madrid, where he founded the Spanish branch of the House of Bourbon that still reigns today. But before that story begins, Europe went to war. Fearing that the Bourbon family might unite the crowns of France and Spain into a single superpower, England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several German states assembled another grand alliance. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the greatest conflicts of the 18th century. This time, France no longer enjoyed easy victories. The Allied armies were commanded by two of the finest generals of the age, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, and Prince Eugene of Savoy. Battle after battle shattered the aura of French invincibility. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet, each became synonymous with staggering casualties and mounting exhaustion. Then, nature delivered another devastating blow. The winter of 1709 became one of the harshest Europe had experienced in centuries. Rivers froze solid. Harvests failed beneath the snow. Livestock perished. Famine spread across France, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives while the war continued. At moments, the kingdom itself seemed on the verge of collapse. The aging Louis, once the triumphant Sun King, found himself appealing directly to his people for endurance and sacrifice. After years of bitter fighting, peace finally came through compromise. Louis's grandson retained the Spanish throne as King Philip V. But one condition proved non-negotiable. The crowns of France and Spain could never be united under the same monarch. Europe had accepted a Bourbon Spain, but it would never permit a Bourbon superstate. As the wars finally ended, personal tragedy descended upon the royal family. In rapid succession, death swept away nearly everyone expected to inherit the throne. Louis's only legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin, died of smallpox. Soon afterward, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, widely regarded as intelligent, reform-minded, and one of the dynasty's brightest hopes, succumbed to disease alongside his wife. Within days, one of their young sons also died. An entire generation of heirs vanished almost overnight. The succession, once so secure, suddenly rested upon a single frail child. Rumors of poison spread through the court. Fear and uncertainty replaced confidence. When Louis XIV died in September 1715, after 72 years on the throne, he had outlived almost everyone who had once stood between him and the future. The crown passed to his 5-year-old great-grandson. Once again, France was ruled by a child. Louis XIV left behind one of the most extraordinary legacies of any monarch in history. He transformed France into the cultural center of Europe. He perfected the model of absolute monarchy. He expanded the kingdom's frontiers. He made French the language of diplomacy. He turned Versailles into the envy of kings. And for more than half a century, every ruler in Europe measured himself against the Sun King. Yet beneath that brilliance lay growing cracks. Decades of war had burdened the kingdom with enormous debt. Religious persecution had driven away thousands of loyal and productive subjects. Heavy taxation strained ordinary families while maintaining the splendor of the monarchy. Louis had concentrated unprecedented power in the hands of the king. The system worked because he possessed the energy, discipline, and authority to sustain it. Whether his successors could do the same remained an unanswered question. The Bourbon dynasty stood at the very height of its glory, but the foundations beneath that glory were beginning to weaken, and the generations that followed would inherit not only the grandeur of the Sun King, but the cost of his ambition. When the childless King of Spain died in 1700 and left his vast empire to a grandson of Louis XIV, he changed the balance of power in Europe and founded a Bourbon dynasty that still reigns today. That grandson was Philip, Duke of Anjou, who became Philip V of Spain. Born and raised at Versailles, he suddenly found himself ruling an empire that stretched across Spain, large parts of Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and an immense overseas domain spanning the Americas and the Philippines. According to tradition, when the late king's will was read before the French court and the sheer scale of the inheritance became clear, Louis XIV presented his grandson to the assembled nobles as the new king of Spain. The Spanish ambassador is said to have exclaimed that the the Pyrenees no longer exist. Whether those were his exact words or not, they perfectly captured the moment. For supporters of the Bourbon family, the mountains separating France and Spain seemed to disappear. For the rest of Europe, the prospect was alarming. Two of the continent's greatest kingdoms were now ruled by the same royal house, raising fears that Bourbon power would become impossible to contain. Those fears helped trigger the War of the Spanish Succession, the long conflict discussed earlier. After years of costly fighting, the European powers agreed to a compromise. Philip V would remain King of Spain, but he and all of his descendants permanently renounced any claim to the French throne. Likewise, the French Bourbons renounced their rights to the Spanish crown. The two monarchies would remain forever separate, even though both belonged to the same dynasty. Spain also surrendered several of its European possessions, while Britain emerged with important strategic gains, most notably Gibraltar, whose fortress still guards the entrance to the Mediterranean today. Philip V's reign was long but deeply troubled. Throughout his life, he suffered from severe bouts of depression that often left him unable to govern effectively. During these periods, much of the direction of government fell to those around him, particularly his energetic second wife, Elizabeth Farnese. Determined to secure thrones for her own children, she pursued an ambitious foreign policy focused on restoring Bourbon influence in Italy. The king's mental struggles became so overwhelming that in 1724 he took the extraordinary step of abdicating the throne in favor of his eldest son, hoping to escape the burdens of kingship altogether. Fate intervened almost immediately. Only a few months later, the young king died of smallpox without leaving an heir. Reluctantly, Philip resumed the crown he had so recently surrendered and continued to reign for another 2 decades. Despite the king's personal difficulties, the Spanish Bourbons proved far more energetic than the Habsburg rulers they had replaced. Determined to reverse Spain's long decline, they centralized royal authority, reorganized the administration, modernized the armed forces, and introduced financial reforms inspired in part by the French model. Although progress was uneven, the new dynasty gradually restored much of the effectiveness of the Spanish state. The greatest ruler of the Spanish Bourbon line emerged later in the 18th century. Charles III is widely regarded as one of Spain's finest monarchs. Before inheriting the Spanish throne, he had already spent many years ruling Naples and Sicily, where he earned a reputation as an energetic reformer. He sponsored major building projects, encouraged economic development, and supported the archaeological excavations of the buried Roman cities around Mount Vesuvius, including Pompeii and Herculaneum, discoveries that fascinated all of Europe. When Charles inherited Spain in 1759, he brought that same practical approach to government. He modernized the administration, improved the streets and sanitation of Madrid, encouraged commerce and industry, supported scientific research, and reduced the influence of institutions he believed stood in the way of effective government. Under his leadership, Spain experienced one of the strongest periods of recovery since the 17th century, regaining much of the prestige it had lost after the final Habsburg kings. Although the French and Spanish Bourbons ruled separate kingdoms, they remained close allies. Throughout the 18th century, the two branches repeatedly signed agreements known as the Family Compacts, promising mutual support against their common rival, Great Britain. These alliances reinforced the sense that, despite occupying different thrones, the Bourbon monarchs still belonged to one extended royal family. The scale of the Spanish Bourbon Empire during this period was immense. It stretched from present-day California and the American Southwest through Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and most of South America, before reaching across the Pacific to the Philippines. It was one of the largest empires on Earth. Seeking to strengthen control over these vast territories, the Bourbon kings introduced sweeping administrative reforms throughout the colonies. New viceroyalties were created, royal officials gained greater authority, trade was reorganized, and the crown tightened its supervision over colonial government. These measures increased revenue and strengthened Spain's imperial administration. But they also generated growing resentment among colonial elites, laying some of the foundations for the independence movements that would erupt in the following century. The dynasty's influence extended beyond France and Spain. One of Philip V's sons established a Bourbon kingdom in Naples and Sicily, a line that would later rule the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies for more than a century. Another Bourbon branch inherited the Duchy of Parma in northern Italy. At the height of the 18th century, members of the House of Bourbon simultaneously occupied the thrones of France, Spain, Naples and Sicily, and Parma, giving the family an influence unmatched by any other European dynasty of the age. Yet this golden age did not last. After the death of Charles III, the Spanish crown passed to his son, Charles IV, a well-meaning but indecisive ruler who gradually surrendered much of the direction of government to his favorite minister, Manuel Godoy. Widely disliked by both the nobility and the public, Godoy became a symbol of the corruption and weakness that increasingly plagued the Spanish monarchy. As revolutionary France transformed Europe, Spain found itself drawn first into uneasy alliances and then into dependence upon an even greater force, Napoleon Bonaparte. The crisis reached its climax in 1808. Bitter quarrels between Charles IV and his own son, the future Ferdinand VII, gave Napoleon the opportunity he had been waiting for. Summoning both men to the French town of Bayonne, he pressured first the father and then the son into surrendering their claims to the Spanish throne. Having stripped the Bourbons of their crown, Napoleon handed it instead to his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The Spanish people refused to accept a foreign ruler. Across the kingdom, ordinary citizens, soldiers, clergy, and local leaders rose in rebellion, beginning one of the fiercest resistance movements of the Napoleonic Wars. The conflict that followed tied down hundreds of thousands of French troops for years and became one of the major factors weakening Napoleon's empire. Amid the fighting, representatives gathered in the besieged city of Cadiz and drafted the Constitution of 1812, one of the most influential liberal constitutions of its age. It proclaimed principles of national sovereignty and constitutional government that would continue to challenge Bourbon authority throughout the 19th century. Yet even as the Spanish Bourbons struggled against Napoleon, an even greater upheaval had already begun elsewhere. The Enlightenment ideas that inspired reformers like Charles III were also encouraging people across Europe to question whether any dynasty possessed a natural right to rule. To understand how those ideas exploded into revolution and nearly destroyed the Bourbon dynasty itself, we must return to France, where the 5-year-old great-grandson of Louis XIV inherited the throne in 1715. Louis XV was only 5 years old when he inherited the French throne in 1715. With the Sun King having outlived both his son and grandson, the young king was far too young to govern. Responsibility for the kingdom therefore passed to his nearest adult relative, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, the head of the Bourbon cadet branch. His period in power became known simply as the Regency. Philippe was a striking contrast to the monarch who had preceded him. Intelligent, curious, and highly educated, he was also notorious for his love of pleasure and his disregard for rigid court etiquette. After the austere final years of Louis XIV, the Regency felt like a release. Court life became noticeably more relaxed. Fashionable society shifted back toward Paris, where salons, theaters, and cafes flourished. The arts and sciences enjoyed renewed patronage, while a more carefree spirit spread among the French elite. Yet the regency is remembered just as much for one of the greatest financial disasters in French history. A brilliant but controversial Scottish financier named John Law convinced the government to embrace an ambitious economic experiment. His plan combined a national bank, paper money, and a vast trading company linked to France's North American colonies, particularly the Mississippi Valley. At first, the scheme appeared miraculous. Share prices soared, fortunes were made almost overnight, and speculation swept through Paris as people from every level of society rushed to invest. For a brief moment, it seemed as though wealth could simply be created on paper. The excitement became so intense that the word millionaire is often said to have entered popular use during this extraordinary boom. Then confidence collapsed. The bubble burst. Paper money rapidly lost its value. Thousands of investors saw their fortunes disappear almost as quickly as they had been created. The collapse devastated public confidence and left France deeply suspicious of paper currency and central banking for generations. More importantly, it failed to solve the enormous debts inherited from the expensive wars of Louis XIV, leaving the monarchy's financial problems largely untouched. As Louis XV grew older, he gradually assumed personal control of the government. At first, the young king proved remarkably popular. In 1744, while campaigning with the army, he fell dangerously ill. News of his condition spread rapidly across France. Churches filled with people praying for his recovery, and the nation appeared united in genuine concern for its king. When he recovered, the celebrations were immense. From that moment, Louis earned the affectionate title, the Well-Beloved. It would become the happiest period of his reign. History, however, would remember that title with deep irony. Louis possessed intelligence, charm, and considerable personal dignity. But unlike his great-grandfather, he lacked enthusiasm for the relentless work of government. He often found administrative affairs tedious and increasingly relied on trusted ministers to govern in his place. For many years, the kingdom benefited from the cautious leadership of Cardinal Fleury. Already an elderly statesman when he became the king's chief minister, Fleury pursued peace abroad, restrained government spending where possible, and maintained relative stability throughout much of the kingdom. Under his guidance, France enjoyed several decades of economic recovery and domestic calm. Versailles, during the middle years of Louis XV's reign, became famous not only for politics, but also for culture. No figure embodied that world more completely than Madame de Pompadour. Originally introduced to court as the king's official mistress, she remained one of his closest advisors long after their romantic relationship ended. Far more than a royal favorite, she became one of the most influential women in Europe. She sponsored painters, sculptors, architects, writers, and musicians, helping shape the elegant Rococo style that came to define 18th century France. Her patronage encouraged some of the greatest artists and intellectuals of the age, while her influence extended into government itself. Ministers rose and fell with her support, and she became closely associated with the diplomatic decisions that reshaped European politics. To her enemies, she symbolized everything that had gone wrong with the monarchy, a commoner exercising influence over the king. To her supporters, she represented intelligence, refinement, and enlightened patronage. Behind the elegance of Versailles, however, France's position in Europe was beginning to weaken. During the middle decades of the 18th century, European diplomacy underwent a dramatic transformation known as the Diplomatic Revolution. After centuries of rivalry, France abandoned its traditional hostility toward the Austrian Habsburgs and instead formed an alliance with them. The new partnership was later reinforced through dynastic marriage, permanently altering the balance of power across Europe. The alliance soon drew France into the 7 Years' War, one of the first truly global conflicts in history. Battles were fought not only across Europe, but also in North America, the Caribbean, India, West Africa, and the oceans that connected them. The outcome proved disastrous for France. British victories shattered the French colonial empire. By the peace settlement of 1763, France surrendered almost all of New France in North America, including Canada, while also losing many of its most valuable possessions in India. The defeat marked a decisive turning point in the struggle between Britain and France for overseas supremacy. French prestige suffered enormously. The treasury sank even deeper into debt. And throughout the kingdom, a powerful desire for revenge against Britain began to grow. A desire that would influence French foreign policy for decades to come. As the years passed, Louis XV's popularity steadily declined. Military defeats, mounting financial difficulties, court scandals, and the influence of later royal favorites all combined to damage the reputation of the once beloved king. There had already been an ominous warning. In 1757, a disturbed servant named Robert-François Damiens managed to slip through the palace guards and stab the king with a small knife. Louis survived with only minor injuries. The attack itself, however, shocked Europe. For more than a century, no one had successfully struck the sacred person of a French king. Damiens was executed with extraordinary brutality, but the greater significance lay elsewhere. The aura of unquestioned reverence surrounding the monarchy had begun to crack. During his final years, Louis also became locked in an increasingly bitter struggle with the Parlement, France's powerful high courts. Claiming the right to register royal edicts before they became law, the judges repeatedly blocked new taxes and resisted many of the reforms the monarchy desperately needed. The conflict exposed a growing weakness at the heart of the Bourbon state. Almost everyone agreed the kingdom required reform. Almost no one could agree on how to achieve it. When Louis XV died of smallpox in 1774, he left behind a kingdom that remained one of Europe's greatest powers, but whose foundations had become increasingly fragile. The royal finances were dangerously strained. The army's prestige had suffered. The tax system remained deeply unequal. And throughout France, Enlightenment thinkers were encouraging educated men and women to question inherited privilege, absolute monarchy, and even the traditional foundations of political authority itself. The crown now passed to Louis XV's grandson, Louis XVI. He was conscientious, sincere, and determined to do what he believed was right. But he inherited problems that had been building for generations: an exhausted treasury, a deeply unfair tax system that resisted every attempt at reform, law courts that challenged the authority of the crown, and a society increasingly convinced that the old order could not continue forever. The Bourbon monarchy had reached the edge of its greatest crisis. Neither the young king nor his subjects yet understood just how close France stood to revolution. Louis XVI came to the throne in 1774 at just 19 years old. History often remembers him as the king who lost his crown. But the young man who inherited France was nothing like the arrogant tyrant of revolutionary legend. He was shy, conscientious, and deeply serious about his responsibilities. He loved geography, naval affairs, and mechanical craftsmanship, spending hours working with locks and clocks at a craftsman's bench simply because he enjoyed understanding how things worked. He was also an enthusiastic hunter, and the brief diary he kept is famous for recording successful hunts in greater detail than some of the greatest political events of his reign. None of these qualities made him a bad man, but they made him poorly suited for the greatest political crisis in French history. Louis genuinely wanted to do what was right for his kingdom. His weakness was not cruelty or indifference, it was hesitation. He struggled to make difficult decisions, frequently changed his mind, and was easily influenced by stronger personalities around him. At a moment that demanded bold leadership, France had inherited a king who constantly searched for compromise. His marriage reflected the changing politics of Europe. In 1770, he married the Austrian Archduchess Marie Antoinette, daughter of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa. The union was intended to strengthen the alliance between France and Austria, ending centuries of rivalry between the Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties. Instead, it would become one of the most controversial royal marriages in European history. The greatest challenge facing the new king was not foreign enemies, it was money. Decades of war, extravagant spending, and a deeply unequal tax system had pushed the French monarchy toward bankruptcy. The burden of taxation fell overwhelmingly upon the common people, while much of the nobility and the clergy continued to enjoy extensive exemptions despite owning enormous wealth and land. The kingdom possessed immense resources, but the government struggled to collect them fairly. Everyone agreed the system was broken. Almost no one agreed to sacrifice their own privileges to fix it. One after another, capable finance ministers attempted to rescue the monarchy. And Robert Jacques Turgot argued that France could not tax its way to prosperity. He reduced government spending, sought to liberalize the grain trade, and proposed abolishing many feudal privileges. His reforms threatened powerful interests, and after fierce opposition from the nobility and court, he was dismissed. Next came Jacques Necker, a respected Swiss banker whose careful management restored public confidence for a time. In an unprecedented move, he published the royal accounts, hoping transparency would strengthen trust in the monarchy. Instead, political enemies forced his resignation before lasting reforms could be achieved. Then came Charles Alexandre de Calonne. Recognizing that piecemeal solutions had failed, Calonne proposed sweeping reforms that would require even the privileged classes to contribute more equally through taxation. Confident he could win support, he assembled France's leading nobles in the Assembly of Notables. The plan collapsed. The very men whose cooperation he needed refused to surrender the privileges that had created the crisis in the first place. Each minister saw the problem, each proposed solutions, and each failed against the same wall of entrenched privilege. By the late 1780s, the monarchy's finances had become almost impossible to sustain. An enormous share of government revenue disappeared immediately into servicing old debts, leaving the crown forced to borrow simply to meet its everyday expenses. Then, nature delivered another devastating blow. Poor harvests struck across France. Bread prices soared. For ordinary families, bread was not merely one food among many. It was life itself. As prices climbed, millions found themselves spending most of their income simply trying to survive. The contrast between the dazzling luxury of Versailles and the growing hunger across the countryside became impossible to ignore. The social tensions that had quietly accumulated over generations were now approaching breaking point. Yet at precisely this moment, France committed itself to another enormously expensive war. When Britain's American colonies rebelled against the British Crown, France saw an opportunity to avenge the humiliation of the 7 Years' War. French money, weapons, soldiers, and warships proved decisive in securing American independence, culminating in the victory at Yorktown. Strategically, it was a triumph. Financially, it was a disaster. The enormous cost of supporting the American Revolution pushed the already weakened treasury to the edge of complete collapse. There was another irony that would only become clear with time. French officers who returned from America had witnessed a people overthrow royal authority and establish a new government founded upon liberty, representation, and the rights of man. Combined with the ideas of Enlightenment philosophers already spreading across Europe, those experiences helped fuel demands for political change within France itself. In helping create one revolution abroad, the Bourbon monarchy had unknowingly helped prepare the one that would destroy it at home. Meanwhile, the the young queen was becoming the target of relentless public anger. Marie Antoinette's greatest crime was often simply being Austrian. As economic hardship deepened, countless pamphlets portrayed her as extravagant, selfish, and hopelessly out of touch with ordinary people. Much of this propaganda was wildly exaggerated or completely false, but it proved remarkably effective. Her reputation suffered irreversible damage during the affair of the diamond necklace. In one of history's most extraordinary frauds, con artists used the Queen's name to acquire an enormously expensive diamond necklace without her knowledge. Marie Antoinette had absolutely no involvement in the scheme. Public opinion did not care. The scandal confirmed everything many people already wanted to believe. The monarchy was no longer losing only money. It was losing trust. Fun fact: France's support for American independence left a permanent mark on the United States. In gratitude for French assistance during the Revolutionary War, a county created in Kentucky was named Bourbon County after the French royal house. Whiskey produced in the region eventually adopted the same name, which is why one of America's most famous spirits still carries the name of the dynasty that ruled France. By the late 1780s, the financial crisis could no longer be postponed. Unable to force reforms through the privileged orders or overcome resistance from the law courts, Louis XVI resorted to a measure that no French king had taken for generations. He summoned the Estates General. The assembly represented the three traditional estates of French society: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, and had not met since 1614, during the reign of Louis XIII. Calling it was more than an administrative decision. It was an admission that absolute monarchy could no longer solve its own problems alone. To understand why this was so dangerous, it helps to understand how the Estates General functioned. French society was formally divided into three estates. The first estate was the clergy. The second estate was the nobility. The third estate represented everyone else, from wealthy merchants and lawyers to craftsmen, laborers, and peasants. Although it comprised almost the entire population of France, under the traditional voting system, the first and second estates could simply combine their votes and outnumber the third. The imbalance had long been tolerated. Now it became intolerable. Before the assembly met, communities across the kingdom were invited to prepare lists of grievances, recording the reforms they wished to see. Thousands of these documents poured in from every corner of France, revealing widespread frustration over taxation, privilege, corruption, and injustice. For the first time in generations, ordinary people believed their voices might actually be heard. Instead of calming the kingdom, the process awakened it. When the Estates General assembled at Versailles in 1789, expectations were enormous. Almost immediately, disagreement erupted over how voting should be conducted. The representatives of the Third Estate refused to accept a system that allowed the privileged minority to dominate the overwhelming majority. Declaring that sovereignty belonged not to the estates, but to the nation itself, they proclaimed themselves the National Assembly and swore not to separate until France had been given a constitution. Louis XVI hesitated. He alternated between compromise and resistance. Every delay weakened his authority. Every concession encouraged greater demands. The machinery of absolute monarchy, carefully built over generations by Richelieu, Mazarin, and the Sun King, was beginning to seize apart. And beyond the palace walls, hungry crowds gathered in the streets of Paris. The Bourbon monarchy had reached the greatest crisis in its history. The revolution was about to begin. In the summer of 1789, the crisis finally burst into revolution. After declaring themselves the National Assembly, the representatives of the Third Estate arrived to find their meeting hall locked. Whether it was merely preparation for a royal session or an attempt to block them hardly mattered. They believed they were being silenced. Refusing to disperse, they gathered inside a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they swore one of history's most famous political oaths. They would not separate until France had been given a constitution. It was an extraordinary act of defiance. For the first time, elected representatives openly claimed that their authority came not from the king, but from the nation itself. Meanwhile, Paris was reaching its breaking point. Bread had become scarce. Prices continued to climb. Rumors spread through the streets that royal troops were gathering around the capital to crush both the National Assembly and the growing unrest by force. Fear quickly turned into action. On the 14th of July, 1789, crowds marched toward the Bastille. Although the medieval fortress held only a handful of prisoners, it represented something far larger than the people inside its walls. For generations, the Bastille had stood as a symbol of arbitrary royal authority, where individuals could be imprisoned on the king's orders without public trial. After hours of fighting, the fortress fell. Its governor was seized and killed by the crowd, his head carried through the streets on a pike. The fall of the Bastille became the defining image of the French Revolution. It was the moment the Bourbon monarchy visibly lost control of its own capital. The revolution spread far beyond Paris. Across the countryside, panic swept through village after village in what became known as the Great Fear. Wild rumors claimed that aristocrats had hired bands of brigands to destroy crops and punish rebellious peasants. Whether true or not, terrified villagers struck first. Manor houses were attacked. Feudal records were burned. Documents recording centuries of obligations, rents, and noble privileges disappeared into the flames. Within weeks, much of the old feudal order that had dominated rural France for centuries was collapsing. The National Assembly moved with astonishing speed. In one remarkable night, deputies voted to abolish the feudal privileges that had divided French society for generations. Soon afterward, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming that all men were born free and equal in rights, that sovereignty belonged to the nation, and that government existed to serve the people rather than rule over them. The foundations of Bourbon absolutism were being dismantled piece by piece. Then came another turning point. In October 1789, thousands of women, furious over soaring bread prices, marched from Paris to Versailles. Their protest soon became a political revolution. The royal family was compelled to leave the palace and return with the crowd to Paris, where they effectively lived under constant public supervision. Versailles, the magnificent stage upon which Louis XIV had performed absolute monarchy, ceased forever to be Theolute monarchy, ceased forever to be the residence of a reigning French king. For a brief moment, compromise still seemed possible. Many revolutionaries hoped France would become a constitutional monarchy, with Louis XVI reigning under the law rather than above it. But trust between king and nation had already begun to disappear. Louis struggled to accept the loss of the authority his ancestors had spent generations building. In June 1791, the royal family secretly fled Paris, hoping to reach loyal troops near the eastern frontier before escaping revolutionary control. Disguised and traveling by carriage, they almost succeeded. Almost. At the town of Varennes, the king was recognized, arrested, and escorted back to Paris under heavy guard. The flight to Varennes shattered what remained of Louis XVI's credibility. Many French citizens concluded that their king had abandoned them and intended to return at the head of foreign armies. Support for a constitutional monarchy collapsed. Republicanism surged. The danger grew even greater beyond France's borders. Thousands of nobles had already fled the country during the revolution's early years. These émigrés gathered in neighboring German territories, openly urging Europe's monarchs to invade France and restore Bourbon rule by force. Some even formed military units of their own, preparing to march back into France alongside foreign armies. To revolutionaries in Paris, every rumor of invasion seemed to confirm their darkest suspicions. The king could no longer be trusted. War soon transformed fear into certainty. Austria and Prussia, alarmed by revolutionary ideas and anxious to preserve monarchy across Europe, declared war on revolutionary France. Military setbacks, economic hardship, and growing paranoia pushed the revolution toward ever greater extremes. In August 1792, revolutionary crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family now lived. Swiss guards defending the king fought desperately, but were overwhelmed. Hundreds were killed. The monarchy was suspended. Weeks later, France abolished the monarchy altogether and proclaimed itself a republic. Then came an astonishing victory. As Prussian forces advanced toward Paris, the inexperienced armies of the new republic met them near the village of Valmy. The battle itself was relatively small. Its consequences were immense. The French held their ground. The invaders withdrew. For the first time, revolutionary France had defended itself against Europe's greatest monarchies. The Age of Kings suddenly seemed far less certain. The Bourbon dynasty, which had ruled France since Henry IV entered Paris more than 2 centuries earlier, had fallen. The revolution, however, was only becoming more radical. As panic spread through Paris in September 1792, crowds broke into the city's prisons, convinced that imprisoned enemies would join the invading armies. Over several horrific days, well over 1,000 prisoners were massacred. The September massacres shocked Europe and revealed how quickly fear could become violence. Louis XVI's fate was now sealed. The former king was placed on trial before the National Convention, accused of conspiring against the French nation. The debate over his punishment bitterly divided the deputies. When the final vote came, death won by only a narrow margin. On the 21st of January 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine. Before a silent crowd, the descendant of Henry IV, Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and Louis XV was publicly executed. For the first time in centuries, a king of France had been put to death by his own people in the name of the nation. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette followed him to the scaffold. Her trial was little more than revolutionary theater, and she met the same fate beneath the guillotine. Their young son, regarded by royalists as Louis XVII, spent his remaining years imprisoned under harsh conditions before dying in captivity, never exercising any real royal authority. The fall of the Bourbons stunned Europe. A dynasty that had stood at the center of continental politics for nearly 200 years had collapsed with breathtaking speed. The sacred rituals of monarchy, the holy oil of rams, the royal touch, the dazzling magnificence of Versailles, the glory of the Sun King, all had ended beneath the blade of the guillotine. Every crowned head in Europe understood the lesson. If the Bourbons could fall, any dynasty could. Yet the story was not over. Members of the royal family had escaped abroad. The Bourbon kings of Spain still occupied their throne. And after the storms of revolution and the rise of Napoleon, France would once again ask a question it thought had already answered. Should the Bourbons return? After the French Revolution came the rise of one of history's greatest military commanders. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from the turmoil of the Revolution, seized power in 1799, crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, and spent more than a decade reshaping Europe through war and conquest. One monarchy after another fell before his armies, and for a time, it seemed the old dynasties of Europe might disappear forever. But empires built on conquest rarely last. In 1814, after years of exhausting warfare, a coalition of European powers finally forced Napoleon to abdicate. Faced with the question of who should now govern France, the victorious allies reached back to the dynasty that had ruled the kingdom before the Revolution. The Bourbon family returned. The brother of the executed Louis XVI was brought back from exile and proclaimed King Louis XVIII. More than 20 years after the fall of the monarchy, a Bourbon king once again sat upon the throne of France. The period became known as the Bourbon Restoration. The return, however, was far from triumphant. Louis XVIII entered France alongside the armies that had just defeated his country, making it difficult for many Frenchmen to see him as a national king rather than a ruler restored by foreign bayonets. A bitter saying soon spread across France. The Bourbons, people joked, had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. After decades in exile, many members of the royal family seemed to expect the France they had left behind in 1789 still existed, refusing to recognize how profoundly the Revolution and Napoleon had transformed the nation. Louis XVIII understood that this illusion could destroy his reign. Even the numbering of the restored king carried a quiet political message. The title of Louis XVII had never belonged to a reigning monarch. Royalists had reserved it for the young son of Louis XVI, who had died in captivity during the Revolution. By calling himself Louis XVIII, the restored king acknowledged that tragic child as his predecessor. It was a symbolic declaration that, in Bourbon eyes, the monarchy had never legally ceased to exist. Its rule had simply been interrupted. Unlike his younger brother, Louis XVIII accepted that France could never return completely to the old order. Too much had changed. The Revolution had abolished feudal privilege. Napoleon had rewritten the laws and administration of the country. Millions of Frenchmen had built new lives under entirely different institutions. Trying to erase all of that would invite another revolution. Instead, Louis granted the Charter of 1814. It preserved many of the revolution's lasting achievements, including legal equality, representative government, religious tolerance, and the Napoleonic Civil Code, while restoring the Bourbon monarchy within a constitutional framework. The king still possessed considerable authority, but he no longer ruled as an absolute monarch. For a time, the compromise worked. Then Napoleon returned. In 1815, the former emperor escaped from exile on the island of Elba and landed in southern France. As he marched north, soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined his cause. Louis XVIII fled. For one dramatic 100-day period, Napoleon briefly reclaimed his throne. The gamble ended at the Battle of Waterloo. Defeated once and for all by the Allied armies, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his life. The Bourbons returned again. This second restoration proved far more difficult. Among the king's own supporters, deep divisions emerged. The most uncompromising royalists, the ultra-royalists, wanted nothing less than a complete reversal of the revolution. Many had spent years in exile after fleeing revolutionary France. They returned determined to reclaim lost lands, restore old privileges, and punish anyone connected with the revolution or Napoleon. In parts of southern France, these passions erupted into violence. During the period remembered as the White Terror, suspected revolutionaries, Bonapartists, and Protestants were attacked and, in some cases, murdered by royalist mobs seeking revenge for decades of suffering. The atmosphere grew even darker after the assassination of the Duke of Berry, the king's nephew, and the Bourbon family's greatest hope for continuing the senior line. A lone fanatic stabbed him to death in 1820. The murder shocked France. It also strengthened the influence of the ultra-royalists, who demanded harsher measures against all perceived enemies of the monarchy. Louis XVIII generally resisted these pressures, preferring moderation over revenge. but his successor would take a very different path. When Louis XVIII died in 1824, the crown passed to his younger brother. He became Charles X, where Louis XVIII had accepted compromise. Charles believed compromise itself had been the mistake. He remained devoted to the traditional ideals of divine right monarchy and the close alliance between throne and altar. To him, the revolution had been a catastrophe that should never have happened. Unlike previous Bourbon kings since the revolution, Charles insisted on reviving the ancient coronation ceremony at the Cathedral of Reims. The lavish ritual recreated the medieval splendor of the old monarchy almost exactly as it had existed before 1789. The sacred oil was used once more. The traditional oaths were sworn. Charles even performed the ancient royal touch, the centuries-old ceremony in which French kings supposedly cured sufferers of scrofula simply by laying hands upon them. It would be the last coronation of a French king. To supporters, it symbolized the restoration of sacred monarchy. To critics, it appeared hopelessly detached from modern France. Charles steadily alienated the country's growing middle class, liberal politicians, journalists, and much of the educated public. Where Louis XVIII had sought balance, Charles increasingly pushed toward reaction. The breaking point came in July 1830. Attempting to silence opposition, Charles issued a series of decrees restricting freedom of the press, dissolving the elected chamber, and dramatically limiting the electorate. Paris erupted. For 3 days, barricades filled the streets. Students, workers, and ordinary citizens battled royal troops in what became known as the July Revolution. The monarchy collapsed. Charles XIII abdicated and fled into exile. The senior Bourbon line would never again rule France. Remarkably, one final opportunity remained. After the fall of the Second Empire in the 1870s, many politicians favored restoring the monarchy. The obvious candidate was Charles XII's grandson, the Count of Chambord. Parliament was prepared to place him on the throne. Everything seemed ready. Everything except one flag. The Count refused to reign unless France abandoned the revolutionary tricolor and restored the old white Bourbon banner. Most Frenchmen, including many monarchists, refused. The tricolor had become the nation's flag. Neither side would yield. A throne stood waiting. No king would take it. With that extraordinary deadlock, the last realistic chance of restoring the senior Bourbon dynasty quietly disappeared. Yet France did not immediately become a republic. Instead, the crown passed to another branch of the same great family, the House of Orléans. The Orléans branch descended from Philippe, the younger brother of Louis XIV, making them Bourbons by blood, but not members of the senior royal line. Their own history carried a remarkable irony. During the French Revolution, Louis Philippe's father abandoned the royal cause, embraced the revolution, renamed himself Philippe Égalité, and even voted in favor of executing his cousin, King Louis XVI. His loyalty earned him nothing. During the Reign of Terror, he too was guillotined. His son escaped France, spending years wandering Europe in exile, even working as a schoolteacher before history unexpectedly called him home. In 1830, that son became King Louis Philippe. His title reflected a new political age. Rather than calling himself King of France, he adopted the title King of the French, emphasizing that his authority came from the nation rather than from divine right alone. He cultivated the image of an approachable, middle-class monarch, earning the nickname the Citizen King. The July monarchy attempted to balance constitutional government with royal authority while relying heavily on the prosperous bourgeoisie for support. For nearly 18 years, it appeared stable. Then another revolution arrived. Economic hardship, demands for wider political participation and growing dissatisfaction erupted across Europe in 1848. France was swept up once again. Louis-Philippe abdicated without resistance and fled to Britain. The monarchy collapsed. The Second French Republic was proclaimed. With his departure, the long history of Bourbon, and Bourbon descended, kings ruling France, finally came to an end. For more than 2.5 centuries, beginning with Henry IV's triumphal entry into Paris, the House of Bourbon had shaped the destiny of France. Its rule was over. But the dynasty itself survived. Beyond the Pyrenees, another Bourbon branch still occupied one of Europe's oldest thrones. The story of the Bourbons was not ending. It was simply continuing somewhere else. While the French throne was lost forever, the Spanish branch of the Bourbons proved astonishingly durable, surviving revolution, foreign conquest, civil war, dictatorship, and political upheaval to endure into the present day. Their journey through the 19th and 20th centuries was anything but smooth. More than once, the Bourbons were driven from the throne of Spain, only to find their way back again. Napoleon forced them to abdicate in the early 1800s and replaced them with his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as king. After Napoleon's defeat, the dynasty returned. Later in the century, another revolution swept them aside before yet another restoration placed a Bourbon back upon the throne. Few royal houses in Europe fell so often or recovered so many times. It is worth pausing on just how turbulent that century became, because the Spanish Bourbons nearly destroyed themselves in a succession dispute that echoed one of the oldest questions of European monarchy. When King Ferdinand VII died in 1833, he left only a young daughter, Isabella. Before her birth, Spain had generally followed male preference succession, but Ferdinand changed the law to allow his daughter to inherit. His brother, Don Carlos, rejected the change, insisting that the crown belonged to the senior male of the family. The disagreement erupted into the Carlist Wars, a series of brutal civil conflicts that scarred Spain for decades. These were never simply wars over who should wear the crown. They became battles over the future of Spain itself, with the Carlists defending traditional monarchy, regional privileges, and the close alliance of throne and church, while Isabella's supporters rallied behind a more centralized and constitutional state. Entire provinces became battlefields. Generations grew up knowing little but civil war, and the rivalry between Bourbon branches became one of the defining struggles of 19th century Spain. Isabella ultimately kept her throne, but her reign was unstable and deeply controversial. In 1868, another revolution forced her into exile. Spain then experimented with a foreign king, briefly invited an Italian prince to rule, and even became a republic for a short time. None of these experiments produced lasting stability. In 1874, the monarchy was restored once again, this time in the person of Isabella's son, Alfonso XII, whose moderation helped calm a country exhausted by decades of conflict. His own son, Alfonso XIII, would later become the last Bourbon king before Spain's monarchy disappeared once again in 1931. The 20th century brought the dynasty's greatest test. Amid deep political division and growing unrest, Alfonso XIII left Spain, and the country proclaimed a republic. Only a few years later, that republic collapsed into one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern European history, the Spanish Civil War. The nationalist victory brought General Francisco Franco to power, and for nearly 4 decades, Spain remained a dictatorship without a reigning monarch. As the years passed, it increasingly seemed that the Bourbon monarchy had reached its final end. Instead, it experienced one of the most remarkable revivals in royal history. Near the end of his life, Franco designated a young Bourbon prince, Juan Carlos, the grandson of Alfonso XIII, as his successor as head of state. Franco expected the prince to preserve the authoritarian system he had built, but after Franco's death in 1975, King Juan Carlos I did almost the opposite. Rather than extending the dictatorship, he worked with political leaders across the spectrum to dismantle it peacefully and guide Spain toward parliamentary democracy. New political parties were legalized, democratic elections were held, and a new constitution transformed Spain into a modern constitutional monarchy. His defining moment came in 1981, when elements of the military attempted to overthrow the young democracy in a coup. Appearing on national television in military uniform, the king ordered the armed forces to remain loyal to the constitution. His intervention helped isolate the plotters and ensured the failure of the coup. For many Spaniards, that single night secured both Spanish democracy and the future of the monarchy itself. Later in life, Juan Carlos's reputation suffered from financial scandals and controversies that sharply diminished the admiration he had once enjoyed. In 2014, he abdicated in favor of his son. That son is Felipe VI, who remains King of Spain today. Felipe VI inherited the crown at a difficult moment, with public confidence in the monarchy badly shaken by the scandals of the previous reign. Since then, he has worked to rebuild its credibility by presenting himself as a disciplined, transparent, and politically neutral constitutional monarch. He reduced the royal household's budget, increased financial transparency, and even renounced any personal inheritance from his father that might damage the institution's reputation. Unlike the Bourbon kings, who ruled Europe centuries earlier, Felipe does not govern the country. Under Spain's constitution, he reigns as a symbol of national unity, while elected governments exercise political power. And here, the thread that has run through this entire story comes full circle. Felipe VI descends directly from Philip V, the first Spanish Bourbon, who himself was the grandson of Louis XIV. The man who occupies the Spanish throne today is, through an unbroken line, a direct descendant of the Sun King. The bloodline that began with a younger son of St. Louis waited centuries for a crown, built Versailles, survived revolution, lost France, and endured exile still sits upon a European throne in the 21st century. Fun fact: this makes the House of Bourbon one of the longest ruling dynasties in recorded history. Its origins stretch back more than 750 years to the late 13th century, and remarkably, after all the revolutions, wars, assassinations, restorations, and political upheavals, it still possesses a reigning branch today. Very few royal families anywhere in the world can claim such an extraordinary continuity. The dynasty's other branches did not survive as reigning houses, but they left lasting marks across Europe. The Bourbon kings of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and the Bourbon dukes of Parma lost their thrones during the Great Movement for Italian unification in the mid-19th century. The last king of the Two Sicilies made a determined final stand behind the walls of the fortress of Gaeta before surrendering to the armies that would unite Italy under a single crown. Yet the families themselves endured. The Bourbon-Parma line continued through marriage into several European royal houses, and through one of those unions, Bourbon blood still flows in the reigning Grand Ducal family of Luxembourg today, a quiet reminder that dynasties often survive long after their kingdoms disappear. There are also those who continue to claim the lost French throne, even though France remains a republic and no serious political movement seeks to restore a monarchy. Those who follow strict male line succession, known as legitimists, recognize the senior descendant of the Spanish Bourbons, who bears the historic title of Duke of Anjou, as the rightful king of France. Others, known as Orleanists, support the head of the Orléans branch, descended from the citizen king Louis-Philippe, and bearing the traditional title of Count of Paris. The disagreement between these two branches is, in many ways, the same family argument that has echoed through Bourbon history for centuries, whether senior bloodlines outweigh political reality, and whether legitimacy belongs to inheritance alone or also to history itself. Today, these rival claims survive largely as matters of historical tradition rather than practical politics, but they remain a fascinating reminder that old dynastic disputes rarely disappear completely. The House of Bourbon ruled France for more than 2 centuries, transformed Spain, governed kingdoms across Italy, shaped the history of Europe and the Americas, survived revolutions that destroyed other dynasties, and still occupies a throne today. Few families have left a deeper imprint on the modern world. Their story stretches from the age of knights and crusades to the age of constitutional monarchy, from divine right kings crowned with holy oil to elected governments served by ceremonial monarchs. Kingdoms rose and fell around them. Empires expanded and vanished. Palaces were built. Revolutions erupted. Kings were crowned. Kings were executed. And entire branches disappeared into history. Yet somehow, the dynasty endured. That is the remarkable story of the House of Bourbon, a family that waited centuries for a crown, came to dominate Europe, lost almost everything, and still, after more than 700 years, has not quite reached its end. If you made it all the way here, you now know more about the House of Bourbon than almost anyone you will ever meet. If you enjoyed this journey through more than 7 centuries of history, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like. It helps this video reach more people who love history, and it tells me these deep dives are worth making. If this video taught you something new, consider subscribing and joining me for the next documentary. There is another story waiting on screen right now, and I think you're going to enjoy that one just as much. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.